A quick note before we start this episode. Ron's internet was acting up the night we recorded this show. Rather than not record it, we decided to carry on. We were able to fix most of it in editing, but there are a few times where he sounds a little slow. Please bear with us while we get this figured out, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome to Wild and Exposed, your number one adventure, nature, and outdoor photography podcast. Wild and Exposed is hosted by Mike Mauro, Ron Hayes, and Jason Loftus. Thanks for tuning in.
We're back with another episode. So what's going on in Utah, Jason?
Well, it's real windy here, but I think we're all experiencing a little bit of that, right? Just had a great weekend. I hung out with the family and got out and shot some turkeys on Sunday morning a little bit. It's that time of year. Spring is always one of my favorite time of years to shoot, as Ron said. He's mentioned that before. But yeah, getting out and shooting those turkeys, they're starting to strut pretty good. And I found a couple of new areas to check out, so that's always fun. A little bit of a haul from the house to get there, but worth it because there was about 200 to 300 birds with about 50 gobblers. So,
is that a public land or is that private land?
It's private, but it's public road that goes through private areas, so you can access it that way. With turkeys, what I've always found, they're tough to shoot in my experience, unless you have access to a private area that you can set up a blind and just kind of hang out and let them come to you. Shooting them spot and stock, if you will, with a camera is pretty tough, and a lot of it's just you see a lot of turkeys. And I could have taken, a ton of amazing turkeys strutting in the middle of the road photos. But, getting them in some habitat is the trick. And they go into the road because they like it, right? They like that flat area. The hens tend to be up on the side of the road, eating and picking. And those toms are in the road. And it's really cool, right, when they're in that road, because when they fan up and their wings drag the ground, and you can hear it really, really well on the pavement. But yeah, that's the challenge, is getting some habitat without all the other stuff in the way.
And that's a good thing to photograph this time of year anyway, all across the country, because you've got turkeys just about, other than Alaska and Hawaii, I would assume most places between the Rios and the Osceolas and the Merriams and what's the other one? Easterns. There's got to be an opportunity within a couple, probably 2 or 3 hours of anybody that you could find some turkeys, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, come on, man. You talk about a conservation success story. I mean, we have so many turkeys in this state. It's insane. And most of them most ones I'm shooting are Rios, but they're thick and they're everywhere. And you can go up any canyon here in Utah and you're going to see turkeys. So
really?
That's the way Wyoming, when I was a kid, we had turkeys in basically 2 pockets in the state, and both of them were over on the northeast corner of Wyoming, over near Devil's. And there's not a county that doesn't have a thriving turkey population. So it definitely is a success story. And like you say, Mike, you can find them just about anywhere. You're dealing with city birds, though, if you're talking about them dragging their wingtips when they're strutting on the asphalt. Not even on a dirt road. They're just on the asphalt.
Well, what's going on for you, Ron? Are you out chasing turkeys too? Now, you're more into the grouse stuff now, right?
The sharptails have started. It's been, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later on. It's been a little bit frustrating because I think I usually go a little bit later. I started earlier this year because I saw a video from a guy in Alberta, actually, and they were already just going crazy up there on a lek. And so I thought, maybe I'll go up and check a little bit earlier than usual. And there's a lot of snow. There's a lot of weather up in this area where they are, and so they were way spread out. And I think I talked about that either last week or the week before. And just kind of acting different than I've seen them act before. But I have to keep in mind that, this is a lot earlier, so I don't really have apples and apples to compare with. even though that's, I'm comparing them with what I've seen in the past. So, but I don't really have apples and apples because it is a different point in the lekking season. So I don't know. Maybe it's just because everything's not established yet. They're trying to establish a pecking order, no pun intended, and then they'll come back to the traditional lek. So I guess it's a wait and see game from here.
So, and you're not going out for sage grouse just yet. This is just sharptails at the moment.
Yeah, I've gone out. I've gone out to the sage grouse leks just to confirm that the birds are there and they're strutting. I haven't set up any blinds or done anything yet to get ready for that. And I am going to try something different this year. Usually, I just go in a ghillie suit, especially when I'm by myself. This year, I'm going to try to go strictly in the blinds and just kind of see what the difference is, see how those birds react differently to that photo blind than they do to the person on the ghillie suit.
Well, the good thing about being outside is you can keep your social distance and you aren't going to be getting this coronavirus, right? Because I'm told that outside the UV light kills the virus. Have you guys heard that?
I haven't, but I like it. I'm going to go with that.
It's no different than one of those little steri pins in your water, right? It's just
Right,
going to kill
true.
it. The ultraviolet light does it. So I think it promotes a lot of outdoor activities. And along that coronavirus line of thinking, I talked to an old friend of the podcast today, Doug Gardner. He texted me about 6 a.m. this morning. And he's like, hey, can I call you? I have an emergency. And I'm like, what's an emergency? What can I possibly do? He lives in North Carolina, right? I'm like, well, okay. Yeah, sure. Call me. Turns out that he's working on the next Planet Earth project for BBC. And with all this hysteria going on around the country, apparently they're pulling a lot of their crews. Well, he is so dedicated to I can't say what he's probably shooting right now, and it's in Louisiana, I can say that. Normally, he relies on the BBC sending him equipment to shoot this stuff. So whether it's batteries or cards or, he's using the red camera, so he's got, it's just not a card that you can run down to Best Buy and pick up. He's having a hard time getting equipment with all the coronavirus stuff. So he's like, hey, do you have any batteries you can send me? And do you have any mini mags, is what we call the red cards? Do you have any of those that you can send? And I'm like, sure. I can certainly do that. But I've never really sent like 6 big, huge lithium ion batteries through the mail. I order them through the mail, but I usually order them 1 or 2 at a time. But they are always put up with hazardous materials, and you can't air ship them. It has to be ground shipping. So I wrapped them all up in a box with a card and one of those mini mags, and I went down to UPS today and sent it off to him so that he can continue doing his shoot even though he can't get any equipment. It's an interesting time. He's just so determined, and he's such a dedicated shooter that this is a very timely thing that he's shooting. By not being out there for one day, he could miss what's going on, and he's been shooting it already for 2 weeks. Who knows when it's going to happen, but he's got to be there to do it. So he was in a panic this morning, but hopefully we're going to be able to help him out. Those batteries won't get there since they're going ground from Colorado to Louisiana is like told me Thursday. Thursday they would get there. So anyhow, that's what's going on here. I'm still doing the hard drive, digital asset management stuff, so I haven't got out in the field at all. But you keep inspiring me, both of you guys, by getting out there. So I'm going to have to make some time and go. And it sounds like we're going to get a trip put together here shortly, so we should all get out in the field together for the first time this spring, which will be kind of nice.
Yeah.
Well, we may be able to, if right, Ron? May.
Well, we will. It's just a matter of where. If we can't get to the one lek that we're looking at, then certainly we've got other options. It's just who gets to travel furthest.
Yeah.
I think that's what it comes down to, is what's accessible.
Well, the way we got it worked out right now, isn't it? We're going to meet up at a spot that's about equidistance for all of us, right? About 4 hours? No, it's probably a little bit shorter for Jason.
A little bit shorter for Jason, not a lot.
Yeah, it's about 3 hours for me, but it's not too bad.
I heard that up in the mountains here in Colorado, they've closed all the ski areas. And this is like the busy time right now. It's like cranking with spring break and all that kind of stuff going on. And they shut down all the hotels, VRBOs. Everything is no mas. So I don't know. I mean, if we end up in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, we better bring a tent.
We're not going to have to buy toilet paper. We'll just use wet wipes, which is not in as high a demand currently.
What
were you going to say, Jason? You can't talk.
My heck. I was telling Ron that I saw a blurb that the Native American parks are shutting down. So like Monument Valley and some of the other parks like that. And you start seeing this domino effect, and it's probably just a matter of time before the national parks shut down too. So, it's going to be, if you're going to get out and shoot, you're going to have to be creative and you have to go find some opportunities, but they're out there, so.
All right, well, let's get into our pro tips. So for our first one, I know, Jason, yours is probably the most solid pro tip of them all. So let's start with you.
In one of the previous episodes, we talked a little bit about some issues I was having with my, with the images I was seeing, my playback images on my Sony. And because we have such awesome listeners, and Kate and Adam were listening to the podcast, and they're a couple of the folks that have helped me so much with my Sony setup and helped me understand my Sony camera and how to set it up properly. They actually reached out to me after they listened to the podcast and told me how to address that issue. And it's called a DRO setting. I don't know exactly what the DRO stands for, but basically it creates an HDR preview of your image if you have that on. And that's what was happening to me, is it was trying to make an adjustment to my exposure and making it an HDR version to show me a preview of my image. And that's why anything I would shoot wouldn't match what I was producing. So I flipped that sucker off, and when I was out shooting turkeys on Sunday, like magic, it went away, and I haven't had any more issues with it. So yeah, thanks to Adam and Kate Rice for texting me and helping me out with that little setting. And hopefully, that helps somebody else out here too that's listening. I know a couple of the folks I was shooting with this weekend are Sony shooters, and they were having the same issue. And when I mentioned it to them, they had no clue. And they went in and changed that setting, and we're all very, tickled with the result. So
your main issue was in the camera review, not necessarily getting it into Lightroom.
Correct. It was just that, I'm so used to, and I love my Nikon. As I mentioned before, I still have my Nikon gear. I don't plan on getting rid of my Nikon gear anytime soon. And when I shoot with my Nikon, I get that immediate playback image, and I use that to make sure I'm adjusted properly on a lot of my settings, right? So I'll zoom in 100% and check my exposure and my details and such. And with the Sony, it's a little different. That's one of the things I think I mentioned in that last podcast that I wasn't real happy with. And part of that frustration was just that very fact that when you take the image, when you go into playback, it's not what you saw in the viewfinder, because it's creating this preview image. It's an HDR, and it's making adjustments for you in a JPEG. So knowing that, now with these turkey images I took, they come over just like I saw. I didn't have any issues at all. And when I put them in the Lightroom, they were exactly what I saw in the back of my camera. So yeah, big thanks to those guys.
So we should give them you already gave them a shout out, but their Instagram is Car Photography, KAR Photography. So that's Kate and Adam Rice, KAR Photography. And they're actually doing workshops. So if you are a Sony shooter, and if you're not up like Jason was, not up on all these settings, I know those guys know that camera way better than most. So if you're a Sony shooter and you're interested in a workshop, maybe that would be a good group to go with, because they would help you with camera issues just as much as they would help with finding wildlife.
Yeah, and Kate, in addition to being Sony shooters and knowing that camera, they're great photographers. Kate actually won the Wyoming Wildlife Contest this year. So props.
Well, that's cool.
Her again. Yeah.
What was the image of? Do you know?
It was a fox chasing a mouse across the snow, and it was the mouse was just, it looked like it was downhill. I don't know what the what their perspective was, but it looked like it was going downhill and the mouse was running away from a red fox. And the fox was kind of spread out on the snow trying to maintain balance as it was pursuing the mouse.
Well,
But
that's
it was
pretty
a
cool.
great shot. Good action shot.
Wow. Well, that's a good shout out for those guys, and hopefully, I'm sure they've got a website too, so we can put that show or that link in the show notes. And if you're interested, look them up. So, Ron, let's hear what you've got for a pro tip.
Well, mine kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the grouse, and things aren't exactly the way they normally are. Um, but the biggest thing is just to be patient. It'll come back. Don't push the shot because you're going to end up driving those animals even further away from from where they normally are. So I have taken one guy out this spring, and I think it was frustrating for him because um, he was wanting the images, came a long ways, wanted to get the images of these grouse, but they weren't behaving like they normally do. And, you just can't push it. So be patient. When you have these wildlife opportunities, like Jason was talking about with the turkeys, we don't want our behavior to influence the animals. So, basically the only thing that we can do is just sit and watch and enjoy the behavior that we're witnessing or that we're blessed to be able to witness, and just be patient. Those animals are going to give us the opportunity. It may not happen today, it may not happen tomorrow, but it'll come.
Well, and I think if you listen to the last podcast with Drew, he said the same thing too, right? We talked about that experience where he had some bears, and just with his guiding knowledge, he knew that it was a sow and a cub that took off. And he's,
Yeah.
some
No,
other
that's
photographers were
right.
following that sow and cub, and he's like, nah, they're going to be back in 15 minutes. Let's just set up the shot. And he was right. He knew it. He had the benefit of that knowledge of that species, but we got into a big discussion on patience, and it pays off way more than it doesn't. You're still, like you just said, you're still not, there's going to be times where you end up with 0 images, but there's going to be times where you end up with the killer image too if you just patient and wait it out. Now, with sharptails, you can actually move a little bit, and if they fly off the luck, they will come back. Whereas if you do that with sage grouse, you're done, right?
Yep. So if you get, like Jason's had a lot of experience with them too. You get a raptor that flies over, you have a golden eagle that flies over the lek and they leave. You're done for the day. Might as well go have breakfast, a cup of coffee,
So that speaks
because you can't have
huge.
coffee before you go.
That speaks, well, I can, you can't. That speaks huge to the patience. If you don't have it, don't push it. If you booger those sage grouse off the lek, you're done. If you are trying to push it, don't. If you are chill in those leks with sage grouse, you could have 2 hours, right? Or 3 hours with
Exactly.
those birds. If they, and you're going to get it eventually. So just kind of hang tight.
And there, you're talking about the propagation of a species. It's kind of on the brink, so you don't want to push them at all anyway. They have enough obstacles their way to be able to successfully rear a brood of chicks. So give them their space, sit back, wait, and enjoy it. It's fun to watch whether you're getting images or not.
Right.
So just sit back and relax and enjoy the ride, so to speak.
So about patience, and it was actually shooting sage grouse, and it was the year before last. Last year I didn't have any luck at all shooting grouse. I went out 3 different times and just never connected. But the year before that, I was out shooting, and I went to this lek that we're talking about going and visiting, and it's not real well known, so it doesn't really get any other traffic other than us. And we were out there to get. So the way we do it, Ron, back to your comment you made earlier with the blinds, we actually try to get there about 3:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, and go out onto the lek and set up our blinds, and then just get in the blind, and we just wait until sunrise. And so you've got to do some scouting beforehand, right? So you've got to go out, do some scouting, find out where you want to be, and then so you can go back in the dark. So then you mark your spot and go back in the dark and then get set up. Anyways, long story short, the first morning we did that right as things were starting to get good. Grouse start flying into the lek as early as 4:30 in the morning. and they're doing their thing pretty early, and they they got going, and the light was just starting to get to the point where we could shoot, and a coyote came running in and scared every single grouse out of the county. I mean, they were just gone. And so we know, we know it's over. So we packed up and went home, and we did the same thing the next morning. And it's about a 3-hour drive for me to get up there. So I'm leaving my house about midnight again, heading up, and get there about 3 o'clock in the morning, set up, same story. Just the same thing the next morning, just starting to get light. Hadn't even clicked the shutter yet. And here comes a raptor. It was actually a golden eagle that was cruising over. And of course, it was over. Every grouse left the lek, and packed up my stuff and went home. So that year too, as well, I never really got any shooting on that lek. I went to a different lek and actually was able to get some shots. But it can be very frustrating. You've got to put your time in, like we keep talking about, and you've got to just keep at it. And eventually it'll come together. But I've found sage grouse, for me, it's about a 50-50 endeavor. 50% of the time it'll work out, and the other 50% of the time it's just not going to, and you've just got to be willing to accept that. So
it's a good thing it happens this time of year, right? When you've got all the patients too, because if that happened during the elk rut, I think nobody would have any sage grouse pictures, right?
Yeah, right.
And then you think about your market for a sage grouse picture. I mean, there's just not that many opportunities to put that image out there. So if you look at the success ratio of images, the amount of time that you spend getting one good sage grouse image compared to one good elk image is like, there's no comparison. It just takes it could take years to get a good sage grouse. Well, that's a good addition to it. And patience is, that's the name of the game with everything, with all the wildlife. It doesn't matter what you're shooting. Just predict it and be patient, and it's going to happen. You just got to put in your time. Well, for my pro tip, again, like I told you earlier, I haven't been out in the field at all. It's just been nothing but data management. Putting these podcasts up on YouTube has been fun. You start editing a podcast, and you're like, oh, I got a perfect image that's going to illustrate what Ron just said or what Jason said. So I'll stop editing the podcast and I'll go on the hunt for an image. And I've got to tell you, I am pretty organized, and I don't lose stuff. Well, I don't lose it as in it's in this room, but I can spend 2-3 hours looking for one image very easily. And I keep trying to figure out what is the best way to deal with this data. Do you guys change your file name in your camera for different shoots?
No.
So I do and I don't. I go in spurts. And my tip is, I think you can change the prefix that's in your file name for every shoot. What I've been running into is I have this software where I can go in and if I can remember, we were shooting elk and this was the bull we were shooting and it was in 2014. I can remember that much. So I've got a little bit of information, and then I can find an image from that shoot, but I can't find the specific image I'm thinking about that illustrates for our YouTube video, right? So then I'll take that number and I'll do a search in my database. I use a program called Disk Catalog. And what that does is I put in a drive and I run it through Disk Catalog, and it basically makes a disk directory of that particular hard drive. And it shows you everything that's on the drive. So you don't have to have the drive plugged in to look at the contents of that drive. And I've got every drive in this room in that system, right? So then once I know a number of a file, I can go and do a search for that number, and then it's going to tell me which drive it's on. The problem I've been running into is if you don't reset your file name, you can end up with the same file name for 20 different images.
Just had this come up, actually. A friend of mine was doing a shoot, and it doesn't really matter necessarily until you get to 10,000. So if you have 10,000 images of the same shoot, once you roll over from 9,999 and you roll back, if you're not changing things, if you're not changing a prefix, you're causing some serious problems for Lightroom trying to handle those files and to keep them organized when you on the import.
When I'm out on a commercial job, they'll give me a shot list, and they'll have numbered shots. We need 1 through 36, and you're just going to go screaming through these images. And sometimes we're shooting a lot of sports, and I might shoot 1,000 images trying to get that one shot that is what they want. And then if I'm shooting 36, that's 36,000 images potentially, right? So you're going to cycle through that numbering sequence quite often. So on that particular shoot, I was changing my prefix. Shot number 1, I named it this prefix. Shot number 2, I changed it to that prefix. But then that's a whole mindset that you got to get into where you're like, okay, I'm on to shot number 2. Let's change the prefix. The day's going good and you're getting good images. That's the last thing you're thinking about is, oh, I need to change this. It's really tough. And I've just been having tons of issues with how do I find that image so I don't have 20 images of the same number. The other issue you can run into is you're going to overwrite. You know how sometimes you drag it in and you say, or the computer will say, this image exists already. And you're like, it can get really confusing. What I'll do during a day, if I'm shooting 3 or 4 cards, I'll do card 1 and then all the images from card 1. And then card 2, I'll separate it into different files so that I don't have that potential of overwriting a file. I don't know. I mean, there's so many ways to figure this out, and there's so many ways to get it done right. And the more I go through these images and the more I go searching for images, I'm just going to set my brain to function so that like every day you change a file name. I mean, there's not too many days other than when I do these commercial shoots where I'll shoot 10,000 other than Eagles.
Right.
But maybe that's the thing. Every day you just wake up and part of your routine is you go in and you change that file name. And then it makes it easier down the road too, because if you're very creative, you can change it. If you're shooting grouse, it's GRU and then let it assign the number. Or if you're shooting elk, it's ELK. But then you can only use elk once, right? You don't want to use elk 3 times. You just need to be pretty random with it so that every time it's a different prefix.
If you look over Mike's like right elbow, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see a small example of what he's dealing with, because you can see that long line of discs right down there. And most of us don't have the same type of issues with file management that Michael has, because he's been shooting commercially for a long time. So there's hundreds of drives, and each of them's 8 terabytes or.
Yeah, they range from 4 to 6 to 8 terabyte drives throughout. Yeah, and that is the problem. I don't know what the answer is, and you're right. My issue is probably a little bit more difficult than most people, but I think it's really easy to run into that problem. If you're not changing it throughout the course of the year, for sure, you're going to shoot 10,000 images. When you end up with 3, 4, 500,000 images in your portfolio, that's a lot of stuff to wade through to find that one image. So that's my tip. It kind of evolved as we were talking about it, but hopefully it made sense. So what we thought we would talk about for our content today, for our main discussion, was lens choice. And I thought what we could do is just go through what's your favorite lens and why. But then I'm sure we're going to get into a conversation about other lenses. I mean, I don't think any one of us ever goes out into the field with just one lens. Although, well, I could say we go in the field with one lens, but a lot of times you might go to a shoot where you got your backpack where you leave it in a car and you have 3 or 4 lenses, but maybe you just go out in the field with one. We all have our go-to lens. What is the reason for that, and why do you use it? So let's start with you, Ron. What is yours?
So the combination of these two is actually why I switched from Canon to Nikon, because I didn't, I had enjoyed using Canon. My issue was that they didn't offer the same range and that the Nikon did with their 200 to 500. And it is, without a doubt, at this point in time, what I use probably 90% of the time when I'm on a wildlife shoot. And you hear, I don't know everybody's background that's listening, but you hear people talk about the trinity of lenses, and typically it's like a short zoom, like a 16 to 35, mid zoom 24 to 70, and then you've got the 70 to 200. So that would be the trinity of lenses for, say, a portrait photographer. For a wildlife photographer, I think that 24 to 70, because you want that fast short zoom so you can get those environmental portraits. And then from there, it kind of varies. Some people it's 70 to 200, and then, like a 200 to 500. And then for some people, it's 70 to 200, 200 to 500, and then a long prime, like a 600 F4. So it just kind of varies. But the 200 to 500, it's 5.6 throughout the zoom range. And what that does is it gives you the ability to, it's not an F4, so you can't get that real shallow depth of field. But I've found that most of the time it's sufficient. So if you want to isolate your subject and add some bokeh, nice clean background by blurring everything out, you can still do it with that f5.6 lens. And so besides that, the zoom range of 200 to 500 fits most scenarios that I've been in. The only thing that I would say that I like anything longer is with birds and, grouse, or especially like the small songbirds. If you're photographing small songbirds, having that, that 600 with the F4, I think it definitely helps you out. But I have got mine for sale currently. I just don't use it enough to justify. It's almost what, 5 times as much as the 200 to 500, and I just don't use it enough to justify. I could rent one if I needed it anytime I wanted, and still have one available, and probably have a newer version than the one I've got. But it sits far too much for being as expensive a lens as it is. So that 200 to 500 is definitely my favorite.
So you were cutting out a little bit because of Skype. I don't know if we'll get that clean recording, but you said you have your 600 F4 up for sale, right?
I do, yeah. And like I said, the reason is just because it sits too much. So the 200 to 500 meets 95% of my needs.
Right. So unless you're like Don Jones or Jamin Hunter, who really just shoots birds all the time.
Primarily birds. Yep.
Yeah. All right. What about you, Jason? What's your go-to? I mean, and it's changed for you. I guess you could talk about that change too. I think maybe not too much. Well, I don't know. You've changed camera systems a little bit,
Yeah.
so it's probably changed a bit.
Yeah, it has. Ron's spot on with the way I think about it and approach my lens selection too. I actually have a couple other lenses that I've just picked up over the years that I've thought would be kind of cool to play with. For example, I have a 105 that I think I've used twice, and it's currently for sale. Um, and I have a 24 to 120, which is a great lens, the Nikon F4. It's just a great walk around lens. But I also picked up the 24 to 70, and that's become my go-to for any kind of landscape type or walk around type photography. So, I like to have that good opportunity, or a good option for some landscape type stuff. So the 24 to 70 with my Nikon is still my go-to for that. And then I kind of skip the whole 70 to 200 because I just don't see the need for it, to be quite honest, with the type of photography I do. If I got into more portrait stuff, that'd probably be a really necessary lens to have, like Ron alluded to, but I haven't gone there yet. So for me, the next lens I had in my Nikon lineup was the 2 to 500, and I'm with Ron. I mean, that was the lens I used. That setup was my D810 at the time, and that 2 to 500 was my go-to setup. It was quick, easy to handhold. That lens is sharp throughout the entire range, and you can get the bokeh you want if you set up right, set up your shots properly. There's times when it doesn't work as well, obviously, but for the most part, it does a pretty dang good job. And for the money, it's amazing. It's hard to beat. Then beyond that, I actually have my 500 millimeter f4 prime. It's a Nikon, and that is my favorite lens. Even today, it's my favorite lens. But when I want to do any kind of video, when I want to do any kind of long distance stuff, I can throw the 1.4 TC on there, and I can get out to, I've done the math before, around 740, I think, 740 millimeters. So, that's nice. And it's just hard to beat the bokeh. It's hard to beat the color rendition out of that lens. There's a reason those lenses are more money. It does get old carrying that thing around. I'll tell you what, after you carry a 2 to 500 and a D810, and then you strap that bad boy on a tripod and haul it around, it's night and day. And I don't do hardly any hand holding at all with that setup. I really am a believer in trying to use a tripod, especially with the D850, because it's a higher megapixel camera. But then recently I picked up, as I mentioned, the Sony A7R4 and the 2 to 600. And I'll tell you what, man, that's become my go-to for anything handheld for sure. I haven't touched my D810 and my 2 to 500 for quite a while. And I think a big part of it is it's still a great setup. It does just fine. But there's some benefits that Sony has that this doesn't. The higher megapixels is part of it, but for the image part of it. But from the lens part of it, it's really that zoom range is 2 to 600. It's a 5.6 to 6.3, but it's basically 6.3 like we've talked about. Once you hit 300 millimeters, you're 6.3. So I'll just call it a 6.3 lens. So you do lose a little bit of that bokeh opportunity, but again, you can get it if you set up your shots properly. And it's just insane. I mean, it's a 90-degree turn to go from 200 to 600. The one thing I don't like about the 2 to 500 is you've got to crank that thing to get it out to 500, or crank it back pretty good of a few turns to get it back to 200. But other than that, this lens is more expensive. It's a couple $1,000 versus I think you can get the Nikon on sale when you're looking for about $1,200. But both great lenses. I just this A7R4 and the 2 to 600 has become my go-to. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I'm at right now.
The biggest complaint I heard was that 6.3. The thing you just said is you got to set up your shot right. You just can't, it just takes a little bit of time to figure out what the situation is that gives you the look that you want, right?
Yeah, and that's not always easy too. There's times when you just won't get it. If you really are trying to create that bokeh feel, and there's certain scenarios where you're just not going to get it with that lens. This is bottom line, So.
Can you just explain for people what that look is that you're trying to get? So when you say bokeh, what that means something to everybody, I think, but what is that look that you're trying to get?
So for me, and okay, that's a great point. And the bokeh for me it's really just that kind of that depth of feel, and it's the kind of that soft, maybe blurry is not the right answer, but kind of soft and a somewhat blurred background. It really just makes your image pop more. It makes your subject pop more. And for me, what I've noticed too, and maybe you guys can speak to this, but I've noticed personally that the lens selection really makes a difference on how that bokeh appears as well. So I might get the bokeh I'm looking for on the 2 to 6 or the 2 to 5, but it's hard to beat the bokeh that you get out of that 500 f4. And it's not just about the aperture, right? It's not just about that f6.3 versus the f4. There's more to it than that. It's the amount of glass, it's the coatings on the glass, it's the technology of the lens, and all those other factors play into it. And your settings play into it too. I mean, that's why, photography is not just like that. That's why f8, it's not f8, it's not f8, right, Ron?
Exactly.
So you've got to understand a lot of different things to be able to make an image that you're looking for. With an f4 prime, it's a lot easier to create that bokeh feel that you're looking for. With the other lenses that are zoom lenses, it can be a little bit more difficult.
And by easy, you just mean the situation is so much easier. Let's just put an example out there. So if you're shooting a turkey, like you were out doing, and you have your 2 to 6, and you have a turkey that's 5 feet away from some oak brush that's behind it, then you may not get that bokeh that you're looking for. But if you have a turkey that's 20 yards away from that oak brush, then you're probably going to get that look that you're looking for. Is that kind of a good synopsis? Or
Yeah, I've got an image that I'll throw in here, and it actually came the first day I took the 600 out. Took it out to the golf course because there's a little marsh on the golf course where some yellow-headed blackbirds were nested in these reeds and cattails. And kind of what Jason was talking about in setting up your shot, you've got a cattail background, or just like I said, Mike, the cattails are only about 5 yards behind. And there was one male, and he was up on this same cattail all the time. He'd fly back down, then he'd fly straight back up, same perch. So I just kind of move myself about 20 yards to my right, and I'll send both images so you can kind of see what it does for your image. Um, Move about 20 yards to my right, and there's a pine tree or blue spruce. I can't remember what it was, but anyway, it was about 50 yards, and it was in shadow. So now I've got this black background. Not only do I have the black background, but I shot it at f4. So now that black background, that spruce or pine, whatever it was, is totally out of focus. And now it just looks like somebody put a black board behind that bird, and it just, that yellow-headed blackbird, it just makes them pop. And that's kind of, you can have the same lens, but in setting up your shot differently and just understanding what that's going to do by getting the distance. Jason talked about it again with the bison. If you get more distance, you can get more depth of field, but if you just change your angle and get closer to your subject, your depth of field gets shallower. And then with that night glass, you're going to separate it completely. And then I ended up getting, as he's singing in the morning, in the nice cool morning, get a little mist coming out while he's singing. You can kind of see that note coming up into the air as you get that little bit of condensation from, his breath.
Yeah, and Mike, I don't know if you were like following me around on Sunday morning, but that exact example you just mentioned is what I was fighting on Sunday morning. And in that scenario, it's actually funny you said that, because I actually was trying, because of the situation, I was looking to get the turkey out of in front of that oak brush so I could get that depth that I was looking for. So, like Ron just alluded to, there's options. You may not get that depth with the oak brush behind them, but if you reposition yourself or wait for a window, you can get the shot you're looking for. It just might, even with an f4, if you're doing it with that turkey example and the oak brush is 5 feet behind him, you're gonna have a heck of a time blurring that oak brush out. So.
Well, and I guess my go-to lens is the 2-4 Canon. There's so many good things about the image, but there's so many bad things about the weight. I mean, it's just like what you said with that 500. It's a lot to carry. And for when I first got it, I don't know how old that lens is now, but probably 10 years old or older. I didn't shoot it off of a tripod ever. But then when the trend started going where everybody's going to the 2-5 and everybody's getting all these really awesome shots because you're just so much faster when you're not on a tripod, I made the jump to leaving the tripod in the car and just going out with the 2-4 and just kind of muscle that thing around. And fortunately, these cameras nowadays, you can crank up the ISO and help with that camera shake and some of the stuff that you might end up with. But the 2-4 for me it just does it. And I'm just a little worried about going to the 2-6 with the Sony system just for that reason. I'm just so used to having the f4, and then you can just achieve that bokeh feel so much easier, and you may not miss that shot because you may not have to change your example of 5 feet away. That's always going to be a problem. But if you're dealing with 10 yards, yeah, you might be able to pull it off. Or for sure you're going to get it with 20 yards, but at 20 yards you're probably going to pull it off with 6.3 on your aperture. There's no right or wrong answer for any of this. It's just what your budget allows for, and then what you get used to, I think. Because you can make a cool image with just about anything that's out there. One of the things that I've been thinking about, wildlife photography is evolving, right? So in the beginning, let's just go to like the 80s when it was just getting out there and Mangelsson was shooting the fish in the grizzly bear's mouth and Boyd Norton was doing cool stuff in National Geographic, and anybody could go out there with a big lens and end up with a pretty cool portrait image of just about whatever, and it was cool. But now portrait images are pretty common. So then what are we going to do that's a little different? And what I have a hard time doing is leaving that 2-4 and say, okay, today I'm just going to shoot with the 24-70. I tried it last year a couple of days where I've just like, I'm leaving it. Because if I have it, I'm going to use it. So I have to not even have it with me. Now, the cool thing about that is when you're bebopping through the woods with just a camera body and the 24-70, you can get around in the woods pretty easily. But the problem is if you don't have a subject that's tolerant, it's pretty hard. But there's nothing to me right now in today's kind of world where you're looking at just different trends. If you get a big animal with a big landscape, that's kind of cool. And the only way you're going to get that. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think you need to throw that black and white moose image that you had, throw that back in the show notes again, because that's the epitome of what you're talking about. That image was, man alive. That was a killer.
Well, and I just happened to be in the right situation. I had a really tolerant moose, and he approached me, and it was just the situation where you had fog on the mountaintops, and it was that day where I think the reason I went with that camera and lens combination was because I was carrying the red camera too, and that's a lot of weight. So I was like, well, if I shoot stills, I'm just going to shoot with this, and I'll get what I get. But I had that mindset in my mind. It's like, if I could get a big animal that's fairly close, because if you're shooting, let's say you have a turkey that's 30 yards away with the 24-70, it's a dot, right? You're not going to get a picture that's going to turn anybody's head. There's no magazine editors that are going to be like, oh man, just look at that turkey. They're going to be like, what are you showing me this image for? So if you have the situation that allows that image to happen, if you're going to do the turkey thing, you're going to need to be in a blind or something where that turkey just gets to, 5 feet away. But then you can show the whole habitat, right? You can show the oak brush and the big, huge pine trees or whatever the habitat happens to be. And all of a sudden, you've just got a whole different perspective on this animal and that habitat. It just kind of tells that whole story. Now, when we were interviewing Drew last week, he's got a solution where you can achieve this with big lenses, but you better be Johnny on the spot to get this to happen. But you can stitch these images. And I've tried this before. I've had this idea where I tried it was up with doll sheep. So let's say I found a doll sheep and I've got my 2-4. I get a nice portrait shot of that sheep. Then what you want to do is you want to shoot the picture of the sheep on the edge of the cliff, and then you want to shoot 4 or 5 pictures off to the left or off to the right, or just continue. Don't change anything, just shoot. Then when you get back, you stitch all these images together. Then all of a sudden, you've kind of achieved the same thing that you're going for with a 24-105 or a 24-70. So you've got a big animal, but you also have that landscape. Sounds super easy, but I've tried it a lot, and it's super hard because you have to have just that right situation. And then you can't be autofocusing either, because if you start stitching images together and you got your animal, let's say you focus on that doll sheep, then you scooch over and you hit that focus button again. Now all of a sudden your background that was way off in the distance and out of focus is no longer out of focus. So now you can't stitch those images together anymore. So there's ways to achieve it, but it's super hard to pull it off. We have an article that Drew wrote that's on the website that you guys can go read. When he goes and shoots these polar bears, he's got a stellar shot that he stitched together, and there's no way this image would have ever happened had he not had that thought process in his mind of, okay, there's no way I'm going to move forward or move back. He can't zoom with his feet. He's shooting a polar bear, for crying out loud. You can't be running around. So he's like, okay, I'm going to shoot this, and this, and then I'm going to stitch it together later. Now, you have to hope that that bear is not moving, because it's hard to stitch images together where stuff's moving. A leg is going to be in the wrong position or whatever. So, but he's got some examples where it actually works. So that's one way to do it. But I think if you want to challenge yourself, what I have to do to challenge myself is I have to leave that 2-4 in the car. I have to grab the 24-105 or 24-70. And then you obviously you have to know what you're shooting, and you have to have that right situation. The other thing you could try is remote cameras, and I've done that a little bit too. And that remote technology is getting so much better. So if you can say, okay, we've got a moose that's going to walk down this trail because they walk down that trail every day, or, you could potentially set up a cool shot. Have you guys ever followed the work of David Yarrow?
No.
I haven't.
So I'll put a link in the show notes because it's a really awesome little video that he did. But his whole thing is this whole thought process. He's like, I need to be something different. I need to be something that sets me apart. So if you guys actually look him up on Instagram, David Yarrow, he's getting these shots where you just got massive, big African lion in the frame, but then you're seeing this wide landscape, or you've got an elephant and you're seeing all this really cool stuff. He's done it with polar bears too. What blows your mind about it is it's different. He's out there working it, but he's achieving a lot of that. And when you watch this video, he shows, like with elephants, he'll just set up his camera out in the middle of a field. Like if he knows these elephants are going to be walking across this dry lake bed.
Oh, yeah.
He'll set up his camera out in that dry lake bed and go run back to the truck. And then, because they don't let you out of a car in a safari vehicle if there's animals around. So they predict where these elephants are going to go. He goes and sets up his camera and he's running it with a remote. And then what he does is when they start coming up to that, then he starts banging off shots. There's all kinds of problems wrapped around that, right? I mean, there's focus issues. There's all these things that you're going to run into. Exposure issues. You just don't have your hands on that camera, so you can't make any adjustments. You're just going to have to set it, go back, and then just start hitting your remote to fire that camera and hope you get what you get. And the only way you're going to get good at that is to do it over and over and over. But if you look at those images, I think it's well worth the time.
His stuff is pretty epic. I mean, he's on another level from... He is getting the things that set him apart for sure.
And that's what I was watching before I went and did that moose picture. Because I was like, man, I love this stuff. So that was my whole, creative drive to like, okay, let's try this. Let's just see if you can do it. But I'm not going to take the 2 to 4. Like I said earlier, there's no right or wrong to any of this stuff. You just really got to figure out what works for you, and you just got to go with it. We all shoot the same thing every year. Maybe this year's the year where you're like, okay, I'm going to try it a little different. I'm going to do something a little different. I'm not going to go with my go-to lens. I'm going to go with something that makes you, step out of your comfort zone and try to create something that nobody else is seeing.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I think you can do that same thing too, Mike, with the 500, for example, or your longer lens. So, there's twice this last year that I went into the field with only my 500 prime, and I did not take my 2 to 500. And that really forces you to be more creative with some of your crops. When the action gets hot and heavy and it gets right in your face, you're not going to get images. And if you're trying to get the entire animal in the image, sometimes that just isn't going to happen. So then it really forces you to think on your feet and decide what's a creative crop, how's this going to look good, what's an image I can create, with this situation. So I don't know. I found that to be kind of fun and challenging too. It's not quite the same as you're discussing though, right? With the remote cameras especially, but you get used when you're having a handhold system and it's a zoom, you kind of get used to and comfortable having that zoom range and just being able to do whatever you want. You don't have to create that zoom with your feet all the time. So using a prime can help do some of the same kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I think it's something we all got to be paying attention to. If you want to make a mark in this world, and if you want to have an image that you throw on Instagram, or an image that it's an editor looks at it and says, holy moly, I've never seen that before. That's what's going to set you apart. So it's well worth the time to play around with it. You just got to know you're going to sacrifice those killer images that you could have got had you had your standby. You just got to know that, well, today I just might not get anything. And I think the animals, the wildlife that you're photographing is going to dictate a lot of that. So if, these moose that I was shooting, I'd shot them for 30 days straight. And I just knew if I get in this situation, in this spot, I'm not, and if the animal's coming to me, I'm not approaching the animal, then I might be able to pull this off. So you just got to, it's a specialty thing, but I think it's something to think about. I think it's something to push yourself and really kind of just step out of that zone and make some cool stuff happen.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I think it's a good idea, and I think you've given me some ideas for my summer trip to Alaska. So
hopefully this has been a good discussion for everybody, just to kind of just talk about these lenses. I don't know. Everybody's got a little thought process, but I can tell you this year my focus, and not only do I use that thought process with my stills, but I'm doing it with video too. Because a lot of times with video, it's like, I just want my long lens and I just want to shoot really cool slow-mo of snot coming out of the nostril or morning breath coming out. Or I'm like, I'm just going to take a wide angle and I'm just going to see what I can get with that today and just make it happen. But make sure you check out our show notes, because I will put that video that I referenced from that David Yarrow guy in that. You can watch that little video. And I don't know the guy. Yeah. I know his work. I like his work.
That's what I was going to say is I didn't recognize the name, but as soon as you started talking about his images, you definitely know his work. And I guarantee you everybody's seen it because it's everywhere.
Yeah, he just came out with a book last year, and I think it was very prolific on Instagram with advertising, little ads. And then I followed him anyway, so I got a lot of his stuff. But his stuff is different. He's definitely setting himself apart, and he's making and this whole thing that we do has got to evolve a little bit. If you want to really make it out there, you got to do something a little different.
Well, and if people have questions, right, please write in and let us know. DM one of us, go to the, email us, and just let us know. We'd love to try to answer them in a future episode too, if there are specific questions that we can answer.
Yeah, and then the other thing to have on your radar is we're going to try it out. We're going to try out a little image review as part of the podcast. We haven't figured out all the exact nuts and bolts to this, so just know that it's out there. It's going to come. We're going to put all the requirements for sending in an image, because we want to do it justice. So we want to probably going to submit on Instagram, but then we're going to want real images too, to have a big image up on our screen, so that if we're given some sort of review of an image, we want to see it in a big format. But there's just a lot of little moving parts, and we're going to get all that ironed out here in the next week. So we'll advertise it on our Instagram feed. Each one of us will probably put it out on our personal Instagram feeds, and then we'll also have a page on the website where you can go and you can just follow those instructions on how to submit the image or your images, so that we can make that part of every show.
All right. So thanks for listening to another episode of Wild and Exposed. Please catch up to us on Instagram, YouTube. You subscribe, hit that bell so you know when we've got new content up there, and hit us all up on Facebook. Again, thanks to our hardworking producer, Missy McKenzie. Actually, Michael's been doing a lot of the production as well this last few weeks, but Missy will get mad at me. Michael won't if I fail to mention. So thanks, Missy, and look forward to talking to you all in the field.
We got our windows down, driving down the 405, sing along to the radio. We're gonna make it someday, nothing's gonna get in our way. We will be the biggest band in town.